time. Last year I had all kinds of issues. Okay, my recording has started, so let's make it real. So I think everybody here remembers me from this morning. If you don't remember me from this morning, then well, maybe you've I don't know, had a few extra beers or some wine. In which case, congratulations. Just a little reminder about who I am. My name is Ilan Lipton, and I am. Joe was just remarking about the fancy title that's almost doesn't fit on the slide. I'm the engineering manager for the ASP.NET and Entity Framework team at Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft about 15 years working on ASP.NET that whole time. So I started all the way from the first version of ASP.NET all the way now working on ASP.NET Core and a few other projects such as Entity Framework Core. My team also works on the Orchard project, which I think some of you know about, and a few other projects as well. What this talk is about is building modern applications and using modern technologies with .NET using .NET Standard, .NET Core, Docker, and Azure. So a little bit of this is going over some of the content that I showed this morning, but this morning I only had about 20 or 30 minutes to cover a really broad set of technologies, and in this session we'll really dive much deeper into some of that and really show how everything kind of works together. So let's get started. So remember this morning the big thing was really about .NET Standard. We want you to learn one API with your one programming language, all the tools you already have, but be able to target, reuse all your code on all these platforms that Microsoft supports. And remember, we support just about every platform there is. I've been lugging around this Apple device with me, which means that my backpack weighs about 20 kilos with chargers, adapters, and cables and plugs and everything. I didn't do that for my health to carry around a heavy laptop. I brought that to really show how Microsoft works with every technology, every platform that exists. So last year we came out with .NET Standard 1.x, and it had thousands of APIs in it. It was kind of inspired in part by its predecessor, portable class libraries. Portable class libraries were the initial avenue Microsoft that we had for building code that was reusable on multiple platforms. One of the limitations with portable class libraries is that first of all, it was very difficult to know what platforms you support. And also, the more platforms you want to support, you end up with really small and sometimes difficult to use subsets that are the intersection. Like, oh, I want to do mobile and .NET 4.5 and Windows Phone. You end up with really small intersections of libraries. And with .NET Standard, we define a standard, and then you can pick whichever platforms are supported on that standard. And as I mentioned this morning, with .NET Standard 2.0, we support .NET Framework, .NET Core 2.0, and by the end of this year, we should have both Xamarin for iOS and Android, as well as UWP for Windows Store applications, all supporting .NET Standard 2.0. So if you build your code targeting .NET Standard 2.0, you'll run on all of these platforms without having to change any of your code. Just compile it once, run it everywhere.
So we get too far
here.
Shot.
Let's see if we can figure out how to do that and not completely mess up the recording. Thank you for, let's see. Let's go a little bit down. Worst case, I'll just, is that full? Okay. Keep changing. Okay, perfect. Well, we'll see what happens to the recording. So sorry to anybody looking at the recording if it doesn't look right. We'll see how well. It's a good test of Link or Skype for Business. So we saw this chart this morning, so I don't have to go into kind of a lot of detail into it because I already covered it. But the idea is that we have all these completely different platforms, whether it's mobile devices or desktops or servers or cloud running on any operating system. You can use the same tools that you already use today, including some new tools that we just released, including Visual Studio for Mac that just came out a couple weeks ago. And then, of course, Visual Studio Code is a relatively new member in the Visual Studio family as well. So I don't think I showed this slide this morning. So again, you have your library that you've built targeting .NET Standard. So that's that box in the middle there. And then you can consume that from all those orange boxes on top. So whether it's a .NET Framework application, a .NET Core application, a Xamarin application, great. They all support .NET Standard. You can use that library, use all that code. But usually with libraries, it's a whole stack, right? What does a library reference? It references other libraries, which reference other libraries, which reference other libraries, which ultimately reference .NET or .NET Standard. So a .NET Standard library can reference other existing .NET Standard libraries. That makes sense. That hopefully is not very surprising. You can also reference existing portable class libraries that you have. And one thing that's brand new with .NET Standard 2.0 is if you have an existing library that was targeted at .NET Framework, which, you know, up until about a year ago, that's what almost all libraries targeted, because .NET Framework is really all there was prior to .NET Core. You can now with .NET Standard 2.0, if you have a library that's using .NET Standard 2.0, you can reference any existing NuGet package or library that was also already built against .NET Framework. So you don't have to even recompile your dependencies. That was one thing that was a little bit of a struggle sometimes with .NET Standard 1.x is, well, I have this library that really should work on .NET Standard. It's only using already the API set that's available there. But because that library didn't declare itself as supporting .NET Standard, I wasn't able to add a reference. But with .NET Standard 2.0, as long as you're using APIs that are within the supported list of APIs in .NET Standard 2.0, you can just reference that. So you don't have to worry about, oh, I'm using this library, it's from a year ago before .NET Standard. Well, now you can just use that library. And again, these fancy animated slides I stole. So just a reminder that with these existing .NET Framework libraries, if you look at NuGet.org, again, most libraries on there target .NET Framework, and now you can use at least 70% of those libraries. And of course, we expect that number of libraries to continue to increase. Yeah.
Is there any indicator how you can find out whether they are?
So essentially what you can do is you can try to install, so the question actually, just to make sure the recording is there an indicator on NuGet so you can see what a library targets? So when you browse on NuGet.org, it tells you what target frameworks it supports. And so if it supports .NET Standard specifically, or Xamarin, or portable class library, it'll list all of those supported targets. And then all you need to know is that if something only says .NET Framework, you can also reference that from .NET Standard. Though I think based on what you're saying here, I'll make a suggestion to the NuGet team. Maybe we should add more indicators there, that kind of little checkboxes maybe that say this library we think will work on, you know, these 5 systems. So that might be a really good idea, actually. Peter.
One thing I ran into exploring how .NET Core would go, or .NET Standard would go into IoT devices. It's, of course, we're dealing with different processes at that time. We're going from x86 to ARM and everything. How transparent is that process for us as developers? I know that sometimes we struggle, like, I don't think it compiled because of something missing. So what's the procedure for that? If you say, okay, I'm going to target a Raspberry Pi after this, but I'm developing my Windows machine.
Yeah, so Peter's question is, especially in the world of IoT, where there's a much wider variety of hardware, especially ARM, what should I be thinking about? What do I need to know? I think especially as it pertains to .NET Standard and doing development. So in the .NET world, almost everything you do is targeting MSIL. That's the Microsoft Intermediate Language. So you write C# code that doesn't become x86 code, it becomes MSIL code. And then when you load that code up, the jitter takes that MSIL code and says, oh, well, what platform am I running on? Is it x86? Is it x64? Is it ARM32? Is it ARM64? And so we already support, of course, x32 and x86 and x64. I read an article recently, somebody saying that clearly x86 is better because it's 86 bits. I mean, the math checks out, so I don't know how you can argue that. So we already support, I think we support ARM32. We will support everything that's on there, ARM32 and ARM64. And I know that people in the community have gotten things working on Raspberry Pi devices. In some cases, they had to compile some stuff on their own. But as far as .NET Standard goes, it's kind of a different axis of how to think about things, because everything generally is MSIL. Now, you can do p-invoke, a platform invoke, meaning I'm going to call into the native OS library. So when you do that, you do need to think about, oh, is this on Mac? Is it on Linux? Because the different OSs have different behaviors. On a Mac, you have a dilib file. On Linux, you have .so files. On Windows, you have DLLs. You have to think about 32 or 64-bit. Again, most code doesn't need to worry about this, because if you want to do a lot of I/O or do sockets and things like that, you just talk to .NET. .NET has all the implementations that are OS specific, but there are a few cases where you do have to do some, you're using some custom hardware that maybe needs some particular native OS library in there. There you have to, check what operating system you're running on to achieve that. Okay. So as I mentioned, you can reference .NET Framework libraries, which is really huge. That means that so much of what is on NuGet just becomes available to you automatically. I think we saw this slide this morning, so I think just for the sake of the recording, these are the kinds of APIs that you have, and you really want to think about these. These are a lot of things that are either A, really just super useful things like compression and collections and things like that. But B is the types of things where you need to talk to the operating system. When you're doing file I/O or networking or crypto APIs, you often want to use the native operating system libraries because they perform better sometimes, or they're just kind of a little more targeted to the type of hardware and systems that they run on. And .NET exposes all of these things to you via .NET Standard. So that was .NET Standard 2.0. Now I'm going to talk about .NET Core 2.0, which includes, first of all, of course, an implementation of .NET Standard 2.0. So anything that's in .NET Standard 2.0, if you're using .NET Core 2.0, all available to you. That means Mac, Windows, Linux, it's all there. You can reference the entire framework as a package, and we've also simplified the packaging. We now have for example, for ASP.NET Core, we have a single package that you can reference, Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.all. If you reference that, you have access to all of ASP.NET. You don't have to worry about, oh, I want to use this API, which package is it in? I have to go look it up. I might have to do a search. I have to go edit my project. Not anymore. We have one package, references everything. And then ASP.NET Core 2.0, we have several new features. We have some automatic diagnostics built in, and we'll see a little bit of that a little later with application insights. And we also have Razor pages that I did a quick demo of this morning as well. And I'll kind of jump back into that as well. And then we also, of course, have Entity Framework Core 2.0, which is Microsoft's data access object relational mapper built on .NET Core. Or actually, it's built on .NET Standard, not .NET Core. And that's actually true. It's actually really important to mention, I think, is that both ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework Core, they're built on .NET Standard. So anywhere that .NET Standard runs, you can use ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework Core. And I think that really goes to show how powerful .NET Standard is. It's not just for writing. I mean, this morning I wrote a little greeting library that just says, hello, your name. Well, it's not surprising that you can get that to run on any platform. I mean, you can probably write that in assembly language if you just had like an hour of time, but that's not very interesting. But if you have something as large and as complex as ASP.NET or Entity Framework, I think that really shows what the real power of .NET Standard is. All the stuff you need is in there. So I want to just kind of jump back into the app that I had this morning, and I think just talk about it a little bit more to kind of show what's going on here. So same project as this morning with well, maybe I can actually get the WinForms application to run now. We'll see. We'll see if it wants to cooperate today, or so let's. Maybe that's the first thing I'll do. Let that load. Okay, I think we're almost there. There we go. So let's just kind of, just to make sure it works, I want to run that Windows Forms application. Really complete the demo from this morning. Okay, please work, please work, please work. So again,
how big is the package? How big the reference package .NET Core to hold?
So it's kind of an interesting thing there. So his question is, how big is the package? So are you talking about the NuGet package, or so the NuGet package itself for .NET, actually not for .NET Core, but for .NET Standard 2.0 is actually very, very small. You can think of that package, it's more like if you've done C or C++, it's kind of like the difference between a header file and the actual implementation. So the package itself is really small because there's no code in there. It's just all the API listings. When you actually go run the program, there's a shared runtime that's been installed on your machine already. When you install .NET Core, it installs a shared runtime, and that's the actual implementation. And that's the one that's OS or architecture specific. So if I'm running on ARM32 or x86 or x64 on Linux, this version or that version, there's slightly, because every Linux platform has small differences between them. If I'm running on Debian or Ubuntu or CentOS, they each have small little quirks and differences, but .NET Core abstracts, as it should, abstracts all those differences away from it. So now my Windows Forms application is running, and so there we go. Again, as you'd expect. Now, one thing to, thank you. So I think we can end right here because I've really proven that it all works. I know, it's just truly incredible. But again, because this is real code that's really running, I've compiled it just once. If I change here again to Peter and I debug again, it's this normal Visual Studio experience. It's the same tools I've been using. It's the same everything. It's actually running that code in that library that I built. And speaking of that .NET Standard, if I edit the CS project file, so again, just kind of remind you about how simple the project files really are. You can add additional NuGet packages here, of course, as well. And as I update this to new, for example, if I target .NET Standard 2.0, actually, I'm going off script a little bit, but I suspect that not everything here will compile quite like it did. Now, the Windows Forms application should continue to work just fine because .NET Framework supports .NET Standard 2.0. However, my Android application that I also have in here does not yet support .NET Standard 2.0, so we'll see. I'm guessing that should probably, well, it seemed to succeed. I'm guessing it won't run, though, if I run it. So the thing with .NET Standard is as you go up in versions of .NET Standard, fewer and fewer platforms support it until they get updated. But that's why I'm mentioning that we're updating all those platforms throughout the end of this year to support that. So when you're building a library, you want to target the lowest .NET Standard that you can, and that way you get the broadest reach of systems, which makes sense, right? Every system supports .NET Standard 1.0, but as you go higher and higher, there are, at a given point in time, fewer platforms that support it until those platforms eventually catch up. Okay, back to PowerPoint. So Visual Studio 2017, as I mentioned this morning, just released a few short months ago. Some of the new features are, it has a brand new installer. This is something that I know that everybody at Microsoft really loves because we install new builds of Visual Studio all the time. I'm running some nightly build of Visual Studio that I installed just before I flew out here. The installer, it's much faster and it's much easier to use. So you now, there's this workload experience where you choose what kind of development you want to do, and the installer will pre-select all the subcomponents, because Visual Studio consists of, I think, hundreds of components by now, all the emulators for iOS and Android, all the different libraries and SDKs for all the, for building Office applications, SharePoint applications, .NET applications, C and C++. You choose what kind of workload you want. I'm building games. I'm building mobile apps. I'm building web applications. And then the installer will pick all the components for you.
One remark, if you could take that back to Redmond, is I did that. I really loved the quick install. But then there was an update, and I had to let that run the whole evening again. Would you like to install update 1 of Visual Studio, because that came out, or I think the re-release I was working with the
Okay.
And for some reason or other, it needed a gig and a half again from the way we went and install experience. I like the direction.
Yeah.
Definitely, and the attention to speed.
Yeah, so Peter's saying the Visual Studio's installer is really terrific and you should all use it. That's what Peter said. Yeah. So I believe he did say that, but then he also said that he ran into an issue. So the installer, it is supposed to be very, very fast, of course. We didn't design it to be slow, so it appears something unusual happened on your computer. What I can tell you is this, is that we collect telemetry on every installation, and so we see all the successes, all the failures, we see what the failures are. And so I know for a fact that as long as you eventually were connected to the internet, that sent some telemetry information about exactly what happened. Especially we look at outliers like, oh wait, why did this take half an hour? It was supposed to take 5 minutes to install. So I obviously can't say specifically what the issue is, but I am certain that we collect all this data and we have buckets of data and we'll see, oh, this seems to have happened, on 12% of installations. And so we have engineers that take that. So I don't have to give your feedback to Redmond because the minute you did that, Redmond already had your feedback. Yes, exactly. So the Visual Studio experience in general certainly is the installation experience is much faster. You can install Visual Studio in 20 minutes as opposed to what before used to take a lot of time. You can also uninstall Visual Studio in minutes, but why would you do that? So we have faster navigation within Visual Studio, navigating between files. We did a lot of performance improvements in there. You can now create editor configuration files in Visual Studio. This is really great for teams who like to debate the merits of tabs versus spaces or where the curly braces should go. You can now have your engineering manager, that's me on my team, check in the editor configuration file that says, this project, this is the style we use. Now, the advantage of that is that, especially for open source projects, and well, everybody here in some way or another is involved in an open source project, is when a contributor comes in, they pick up the settings of whoever controls that project. So I know a problem a lot of people had before with Visual Studio is, well, I have my settings and you have yours. If we want to collaborate on a project, or if you work on multiple different projects, it's really hard to coordinate, and I have to keep resetting my settings, and Visual Studio formats the file. Not anymore. You can just save that, check it in. And then also, if somebody changes the editor configuration file, you'll see it in source control, and you can go over to their workstation and say, why are you changing the configuration? Only managers get to set the configuration. Live unit testing, will show a demo of that in just a minute, so we'll dive into that. A lot of improvements to IntelliSense. You can filter, as you're typing in IntelliSense, you can filter the different member types. I only want to see properties or only classes and things like that. There's a new exception helper. We'll see that in a minute. That's the little dialogue that pops up when an exception happens while you're debugging. And we have a lot more refactorings and quick fixes. So Visual Studio sometimes suggests different ways or maybe more optimal ways of writing your code. So you get a little tooltip that kind of comes up and you can use that. Your code. And then support for C#7. So we saw even this morning, I used some of the new C#7 syntax, such as throw expressions. So that's all there in 2017. Now, since then, we've been working on updates. We already did an update 1 and an update 2 that maybe appears to have caused Peter a little bit of problems, but hopefully we're past that. Yeah, it's good. Good time to take a lunch break, coffee break, have a beer maybe. We're hard at work on Visual Studio Update 3. We just did a preview of Update 3 a couple weeks ago, and it has a lot of new things in it. So we continue to improve things like IntelliSense. Live unit testing also supports .NET Core. You can now do code style enforcement on builds, so you can not only say these are the code styles I want you to use on this project, I actually want you to fail the build, so you can't even check in until the build passes because the compiler has enforced the code specification that you have. More diagnostic information about giving tips on API design and security. Even more of those refactorings and quick fixes. We really want Visual Studio to have as much as possible kind of in the box. And then support for C# 7.1. So one of the really cool features in C# 7.1 is support for tuples. Tuples allow you to return more than one return value. It does many things, but for example, it allows you to return more than one return value from a function. So the classic thing you had to do before is either use out parameters, which are really ugly. You don't really want to use a lot of those. Or you have to define your own data structure. So you have to create a struct, and you have to go write that class or struct and return it. With tuples, you can just do everything in line. You can just say, I return an integer and a string and a customer object. And you can compose and decompose these all throughout the system. And one thing I really want to emphasize about a lot of these features is that they have nothing to do with .NET Framework. They have nothing to do with .NET Core. They really have more to do with .NET Standard. So whatever kind of application you're writing, again, you can use live unit testing, you get the code style enforcement, you get to use C# 7.0, C# 7.1, you get all these refactorings and quick fixes, all the IntelliSense improvements. No matter what kind of application you're building, they're all available to you. So let's take a look at live unit testing. Oh, yes, question.
I can remember that about 2 years ago you showed us the new file.
Yes.
And I was a little shocked because it is now again removed back to the XML project file. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So your question is last year I showed the new project.json file. Now we call it the old project.json file. So what's the story about that? There were a few things about project.json. One is everybody knows JSON's way cooler than XML. Everybody knows this. But really, who cares about the file format? That's not really that important. Much more important than that are some of the new things that we did with the project.json experience in Visual Studio. So you saw the CS project that I showed just a minute ago. It was, I think, 5 or 6 lines long, yet I have all of .NET Standard available to me. If you look at this old CS project before that, not a chance. I looked at a default ASP.NET project on using ASP.NET MVC, and I compared it to an ASP.NET Core MVC project using the new CS project file format. The new one was about, I think, 20 lines long. Not too bad. It just had reference .NET Standard, it had a few NuGet package references, and that was it. The previous CS project file for essentially the same project, but using the old CS project format, 250 lines. So we made it about 90% smaller than it was before. So we took all the learnings that we had from project.json and the experience that we provided. Now, a lot of those lines is just listing every single file in the project. That's not interesting. Everybody really got annoyed by that because when you're collaborating on a project, you just added a file and you checked in, so you changed the CS project file, and then you made a change, and then you have a merge conflict, and everybody's been through this at some point or another. So with CS project and the project.json before it, you don't list all the files anymore. Everything that's in your folder is in your project. You can still exclude things if you want, but by default, everything's in there. The other reason we changed to CS Proj is that it's based on MS Build. And a lot of people around the world already had a really big investment in MS Build and the whole build process. And there's a lot of things that you just get by having MS Build. For example, you can write automated scripts and custom targets that change how the project behaves. We, for example, as we change versions of things, with the project.json format, you have to write a lot of custom tools if you want to work with that format, because it's a brand new file format. But by switching to CS Proj, it's a regular MS Build project file. Any tool, any system you have, any knowledge that you have about MS Build completely applies to that file format. So going back to that, I think we just kind of said, well, we took all the new innovation in project.json, but now we've applied it to CS Proj. And so now it's available to far more than just .NET Core. It's available to all .NET Standard projects and hopefully more and more project types going into the future. So live unit testing. So I have a project here. It's again a fairly simple project, or a fairly simple solution. So I have 2 projects in here. I have a class library project that I use for tracking things like workouts. So as I go running, I want to track how far did I run, how long did it take, and any notes about that run that I did. And then I have a test project. We should all have a lot of unit tests, and now in Visual Studio, it's even easier to work with unit tests. So first, let's look at the code that I have. So I have this trainer class here. Reset the demo from last time I did this. Now, the new feature that we have here is called live unit testing. So in the test menu up top, there's a new menu option. I can start a live unit testing session. So let's start that. Now you see it's going to compile everything, and now you see all these little check marks show up, and they have a little clock next to them that says, hey, I'm doing something in the background, just wait a few moments while it's running the unit tests. Well, good news, the unit tests ran and they passed. Or did they? Well, this check here says this line of code, in this case a property, is covered by 8 tests and they all passed. If I click on that, I can see, well, these are the tests that run, and I can see some more details about those tests. But as I scroll down, the story changes a little bit. Some bad news. This line of code, well, the good news is it's covered by tests. The bad news is at least some of the tests are failing. So again, if I click on this, I see there are 9 tests, but it looks like one of them is failing. So kind of a good news, bad news thing. If I continue to scroll down, we see other kinds of annotations here. These lines say, this is bad news. There are no tests covering this at all, so we should probably go add some tests for that. So you can really quickly see in the background Visual Studio is running all my tests and telling me, giving me immediate feedback on the health of my project. Well, okay, I could have done that maybe before with code coverage analysis. There exist a lot of tools for doing that. But I want to investigate some of these test failures. So let's see, what's one of these tests that fails? So one of the tests that fails is this test tweetify with no notes. So I'm going to double click on that and we're going to debug this and figure out, well, we don't want failing tests, right? So let's right click on the test and let's debug the test, and Visual Studio will help us figure out what's going wrong. We can fix the problem and continue on. So the Test Explorer shows up, compiling everything, running the selected test that I have. And this is that exception assistant that I mentioned earlier. And this is one of the improvements that we made. One of the classic problems with null reference exception, which is what's happening here, is I have workout.nodes.substring. Sometimes you have a.b.c.d.e, and well, one of them is null, but which one is it? So you have to hover over every single one and figure it out. Well, the exception assistant now just tells you exactly which one is null. It highlights, well, it wasn't workout. Workout was fine. Workout.nodes was null. And so now we can stop our debugging session and we can start investigating why this happened. So I'm going to go to the definition of that property, or field, I think in this case. And this is the workout class, and there's a constructor that takes in the notes, and it just immediately assigns that notes property, the notes parameter, to the notes field without doing any validation. So I want to fix that. I'm going to use that same new syntax that I used this morning, the null coalescing combined with the throw expression. So throw new argument null exception. I'm a little bit, name of notes. And so now I've added the parameter validation that I want, and we'll look at that. What happened? As I was typing, Visual Studio ran all of my tests, and good news, it's green. But now I'm going to ask everybody here is, I'll zoom in to emphasize, what does that yellow bar mean?
Not saved.
It's not saved. I didn't even save the file. As I was typing and talking, Visual Studio in memory compiled the code literally as I was typing, ran all the unit tests, and gave me feedback. So in theory, what it means is you can just close your eyes and just bash on your keyboard and then just look and see until it's green, and then when it's green, you're done. Yeah. Maybe not recommended, but in theory, the whole monkeys with typewriters typing Shakespeare, Visual Studio helps you do that now. So now that it's passing, I do actually want to save this file, because now that I know that it's good. Yes?
So in order for you to do that, you went and actually started the live unit testing, right?
Yes.
So and this is a small project, and a project of a large size, like would you, like, has there been any testing on like what the performance impacts are in a typical machine of projects of certain sizes?
Okay, I am so happy you asked that question. I did not pay him to ask that question, because that's exactly what I want to talk about. So the question is, well, okay, this is a small project. There's only 10 or 11 unit tests in here. One source project, one test project. Yeah. Great job. It's not hard to make that work. Well, we actually have a lot of features in there. We wanted to make sure this is a real feature. This is not just a toy feature that we demo and, hey, look, I threw an exception and it works. Well, what you can do is, yes, for a large project, so for example, my team works on ASP.NET MVC. At one point, our solution for just MVC, not even all of ASP.NET, for just MVC had 100 projects, including about 15 or so source projects, 15 or so unit test projects, several functional test projects, and a bunch of test websites, because we have to test different configurations of things. Adds up to about 10,000 tests. You probably don't want to run those all the time while you're typing. So what you can do is you can right click on a project, and under this new live tests menu, you can include or exclude, or also just exclude everything but this test project to say, well, I don't want you to run all my tests, just run this subset of tests. Because you're probably not working, usually especially with unit tests, one source project has one test project, so there might be a few hundred, maybe 1,000 or so tests. That's perfectly reasonable. That you can get running in the background. And I believe Visual Studio also has smarts in it saying, well, I know what code you changed because of the code coverage that it did, so I know what tests to run. I don't have to run all 1,000 tests. I can be a little smarter about that. And obviously the first time it has to run all the tests, but as you're typing, it doesn't have to rerun every single test. But nevertheless, you have a lot of options here to control exactly what you're working on. More than that, in the live unit testing options, there's even further things you can control. So first of all, you can say if I'm running on battery, well, in this case, by default, if it gets to 30% battery, stop running live unit testing. When you're on that airplane and you're fixing your code, well, you can manually run your tests for that. And there's just a few other options here also to kind of control, the precise behavior of the live unit testing feature, because we really want to make sure it's not just a demo feature. It's actually useful for real, actual real workloads. So thank you for that question. Yes.
Which version of Visual Studio does it require?
So this is an enterprise feature of Visual Studio. Yeah, so it's new in Visual Studio 2017, and it's in the enterprise edition. Yeah. So that was live unit testing. So next up, I brought this Mac. Let me just unlock it again. So Visual Studio for Mac. So what we wanted to deliver was, as much as possible, the same experience between Mac developers and Windows developers. And the best way to create an experience that feels the same is to have it actually be the same. And so we did that by sharing the same components between Visual Studio for Windows that's already existed and Visual Studio for Mac. So we share things such as the project templates for .NET Core. It's the same exact project templates. They're 100% identical. The editors for some of the file types are exactly the same editors. That way you get the same experience. The debugger that's used in Visual Studio for Mac, same debugger backend as we use on Windows, same experience. Publishing to Azure, same infrastructure. And in the future, we're looking at having even more things be available there. For example, a better JavaScript editor, and also we want to bring the Razor editor for CSHTML files, bring that into Visual Studio for Mac. So you can edit all these things today, but you don't get the full IntelliSense syntax highlighting experience, and we've already started work on bringing that from Visual Studio on Windows to Visual Studio for Mac. So with .NET Core, you get the full experience with .NET Core, including round-tripping between Visual Studio for Mac and Visual Studio for Windows. We also include support for things like working with Docker containers, publishing to Azure Application Services, and support for Azure Functions, which I think I've heard a few people here have been interested in. So unfortunately, the recording won't get to see this because I don't know how to record on a Mac, but everybody here in the audience will just have to attest that it did in fact work. So let me awkwardly reposition this Mac here. Peter, next year, longer cables. Yeah. So here's my Mac. Okay, I think you can actually see the whole screen there, except maybe you can't see what I'm obscuring, but I think that's fine. So I've already loaded up Visual Studio for Mac. Again, pretty kind of normal looking experience if you've used Visual Studio before. And I want to create a new ASP.NET Core project. Remember, ASP.NET Core works on Windows, Mac, and Linux. You also have your other template types here for building iOS applications. You can target other, using Xamarin, you can target other types of platforms, but we're just going to use ASP.NET Core here. We'll call this our DNN demo. And again, because it's the same project template, when I run the project, it'll look exactly the same way that every ASP.NET project starts out. So expand that here. And because this really is the same back-end engines for IntelliSense and things like that, you get real, proper, actual IntelliSense once it restores the... There we go. So this is real IntelliSense. This isn't just text autocomplete. So some editors have kind of an autocomplete experience where it's just doing very basic text matching. This is real IntelliSense. This actually looks at the DLLs and all the metadata and all the projects. You get the full real deal. So we'll call this my DNN demo description page, set a breakpoint. Again, it's a Visual Studio, so I have a debugger. I can run that, and I can be completely 100% productive using Visual Studio for Mac. And remember, ASP.NET Core, we wrote our own brand new web server called Kestrel, which runs cross-platform. That's how we run on all the different platforms. And here's my application. When I go click on the About page, there's my debugger. And all the usual things that you expect to work are there. You have your watch window. You can drill into all the different fields and everything. All the same experience as Visual Studio on Windows. So we can continue the execution. Back into my browser. Where did my browser go? So there it is. That's my DNN demo description page. Now what I'm going to do, oh, they're having a great session in that room. Now what I want to do is reveal this in Finder. How much time? I still have time, right? Yeah. I have until 15 minutes. Okay, that should be fine. So let's close Visual Studio for Mac. And so now I have my little USB drive here, standard USB drive. And what I want to do is, when that shows up, there's my USB disk. So I'll create a folder here called DNN. Then I should be able to, oh, how do I go up one folder? Is that what that button does? No. How do you go up a folder on a Mac? Does anybody know?
You're right. That's totally the right conference for that question.
To the right.
You might click on the folder name at the top.
Left.
This?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Oh, that's cool. Okay, so I can copy these, paste them onto my flash drive. Again, this is not how you should do source control. Please use TFS or Git or something. Do not use USB flash drives. They're obviously not very fast either. This is apparently like the slowest USB thumb drive I've ever used. Also,
It was for demo purposes.
but it's for demo purposes. Really experience, really feel the whole thing. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, okay, so let's eject that, and of course, because it lies to us, it says it's done. It's not really done. I have a little blinking light here. Okay, there we go. Okay, well, I'm going to assume we're done. And now back up. Plug this one in. Plug my USB drive in. I can find the port. So now we have, this is that DNN folder we just created. I'll just open the solution straight up from the flash drive. I'm not even going to copy it. And when that loads, of course, no surprise, you'll see the same project, but really the key here is that it all uses the same solution file format. It uses the same CSproj file format. The code is all .NET Standard and .NET Core, so of course it just works everywhere. Visual Studio is going to verify. It's going to try to restore all the packages, make sure that I have everything, which I should already have everything. And in mere moments, yeah, it's a little extra slow when you're running from a flash drive, but I'm just going to wait for it to finish restoring packages. And I think it's almost done. Okay, I'll try to run and see what happens. Yes?
Because now you had an open project, you could only file any waypoint set. This is like a personal setting on your old computer that does not move to the new one, or how does this work?
So what your question about?
Normally you have like a session file, and when you work on the Mac and only open the project, won't it open the last open file and set waypoints again?
Oh, I see. I'm actually, so the question is the session-specific information about like what files were open, what breakpoints I had. So anyway, here you see the application running. So it, imagine it came from Git or TFS. So it is actually all the same. If I click About, there's the page we just made. As I think you saw just now, it doesn't share the session information because normally, of course, you don't check in that information. I used a thumb drive, so of course the data's there. But I think that Visual Studio for Mac and Visual Studio for Windows have a slightly different file format that they use for those, which again, for the most part, shouldn't really matter because you're not going to actually share those files between the different machines anyway. So yeah, go ahead.
One, I know doing certain shortcuts is a little bit different from Mac, but like are there a lot of the shortcuts that you normally would use on Windows, like are those shortcuts carried over to the Mac version?
So the Visual Studio for Mac has a lot of shortcuts for a lot of things. I don't know that they're the same because some of them are kind of operating system specific shortcuts.
Yeah.
On Mac, of course, the keyboard has slightly different. You have 4 different modifier keys instead of the 3 you have on a kind of typical Windows keyboard. But there are some kind of operating system specific things. For example, on the Mac, you often use the command modifier for both operating system level things and application specific things, whereas in Windows, the Windows key is sort of like the command key, but it's really only for operating system things. So whereas on Windows you use Control C, on Mac it's Command C, but on Mac something like Command H hides the current window, but on Windows, Windows H, well, probably doesn't do anything, but Control H, probably does backspace, probably does some weird things. So they're definitely not exactly the same commands, but it is still very rich in terms of the available keyboard shortcuts and things like that.
My second question, like there's 2 types of like Windows users that tend to use the Mac, right? Like there's some people who like they have to use it for different things that are Mac specific, and others where like they do the dual booting thing, and like, sometimes when we're there doing Windows stuff, and then switch over or whatever. So like with the targeting for that product, like is it primarily for the power users that are want to develop on Mac, or are you also trying to capture the market of like maybe Visual Studio on a Mac will someday support other types of projects?
So there are a few different things that we target. Thank you. There are a few different things that we're targeting. I think there's some things that I'm not expecting to come to Visual Studio for Mac. I'm not expecting Windows Forms support anytime soon on there. I don't know what the plans are there. I'm guessing that's not going to happen. But there are things that are very commonly done in a cross-platform way. So building web applications is, of course, super common. It's very common to have mixed environments with mixed machines and things like that. And so we're certainly kind of going after what we think the primary audiences are, and then building mobile applications. So using your traditional Xamarin type of scenarios for building iOS, Android applications. Those are kind of the main things we're going after right now. And there's other things that I think just based on our priority and what customers are expecting from it, we'll do whatever we can to target, those types of scenarios as well. Yes.
Yes, you mentioned entity framework very briefly. Could you elaborate a little bit more into entity framework and .NET standards too?
Yeah, so Entity Framework Core, it's the newest version of Entity Framework, and it runs on anywhere .NET Standard. Entity Framework Core 1.1 supports .NET Standard 1 point something. I don't remember which version. I think maybe 1.4 and up. Entity Framework Core 2 requires .NET Standard 2.0, which means that it will run on .NET Core on all the operating systems. It runs on .NET Framework 4.6.2 and higher, I think. And it will also eventually run in UWP applications. So wherever .NET Standard 2 is supported, it will run.
Okay, and Entity Framework has connected to both SQL Server but also to MySQL?
Yeah, so Entity Framework, so I want to make sure I get through the next demo, but so I'll answer that very briefly, and then I'm happy to talk much more detail after that. Entity Framework Core has a provider model, so of course we ship a provider for SQL Server, because, well, we make SQL Server, but we also have for Entity Framework Core, we have a SQLite provider, and then there are third-party providers for several other systems, such as MySQL. I think there's working on an Oracle provider, Postgres, and so forth. We also have a prototype of an ODBC provider for Entity Framework Core that's cross-platform, and ODBC already has database connectivity to every kind of database that exists, and so we've at least prototyped an ODBC provider so you can then just connect that to any of the multitude of different kinds of databases that there are.
Okay, so basically everything you're saying, easily can use Entity Framework in .NET Standard on Android, on
Yeah.
the SQLite database.
I don't know that we've specifically tried that, but in theory it should work. I think that the only thing I don't know there is that SQLite requires a native DLL that actually implements it, and I just don't know what the story there is for running SQLite on Android. I'm guessing it's possible, but I haven't tried it. So.
Okay, so we can just send a mail if it's not working.
Yes, yes. Okay, so Azure Diagnostics. So let me I want to really get to the demo. So the short story is this. We want you to be able to diagnose your applications without having to change your application and without having to republish your application. It's very common when your application, your app or microservice is running on the web, it eventually encounters some kind of problem. So what do? You have to guess what the problem is, maybe check the logs. If you don't have enough logs, you have to change your application to log more information and then publish your application again and then hope you've now captured enough information if the error even happens again. That's the classic problem, right? The error just stopped happening and you're never able to reproduce it. So with Azure, we want you to be able to, from the Azure portal, go to your website, just click, I want to enable application insights, and you can really quickly enable analytics and diagnostics, and you can also see really common information about the performance of your application and any crashes that may have happened. Not only that, we want you from Visual Studio to be able to debug a live running application in Azure. So how do we do that? Well, it's not magic, though it certainly feels like magic. So I have an application that's running on Azure, so we'll see how good the internet here is. If it's not working, I can do it without internet. So this is the Azure portal, and I've already enabled application insights for this particular application. And this tile here has what we call the application map. So application insights, not only does it monitor your application, it monitors all the different resources in your application and how they talk to each other. So an web application often has to talk to a back-end, or it has to talk to a database, and that's what we see here on this application map. So we have, this is my web node here. It makes some outgoing HTTP calls. Those seem to be having some problems. It talks to a back-end database and it talks to a back-end CRM. Now, if I click on one of these nodes, I can see some of the errors that are taking place. So one of the errors that I'm having here, it's happened about 100 times because Application Insights is constantly monitoring my application and seeing the health. We see there's this index out of range exception that's happening. So click on that, get some more information. And already in the portal, you get a pretty good amount of information. So you see this is what the error was, this is the URL that was requested, this is when it happened, and so forth. You see information about what the client was. So this is somebody in Chicago running on a PC. That's who was browsing the website when they hit this issue. This already might give me some hint as to what's going on. Is this problem specific to mobile devices accessing my site, or is it a problem that's affecting all kinds of different platforms? Yeah, yes, question.
I guess you are running an ASP.NET web application somewhere. I don't get the whole context. What kind of application is this, and what is it where we want to?
So this application in particular is an ASP.NET MVC application. It's not even running .NET Core, I don't believe. And so with Application Insights, we have integration with .NET Framework and .NET Core, which broadcast various telemetry events. And they also broadcast correlation information. So as a request goes from node to node to node, we track the correlation IDs, and Application Insights reads all that information, and that's how it creates that application map. So it sees as the data flows from between the different nodes, and it also sees the health of all those different nodes. So not only do we see what the error was, we also get the call stack. But sometimes that's not really enough. So what Application Insights also did is I can open up a debug snapshot of the actual error that happened. So I'm not going to download it over the internet that we have here. I already downloaded the file. So it's this new diagnostic session file. It's about 160 megs. It has all the memory and all the diagnostic information that it needs. And first, let me open the solution. So this is the project in question. And it's not a trivial project. There's several different projects in it, in the solution. So I opened that up. So now I have all the source code for my application open. And then next, all I have to do is take that diagnostic session file, drag that into Visual Studio. And what Visual Studio will do is it will map all that information. So it knows my application source code because I have the solution open. And it knows exactly what crashed because it has all the PDB files, the program database files that have all the line mappings from everything. And when it loads that up, what I can do in Visual Studio is I can click this button here and I can start an actual debug session from a crash that happened, maybe several days ago. So I don't have to worry about adding diagnostic information to my site. Application Insights will automatically gather everything. So here's now we see this exception assistant popping up again, says, index out of range exception. Well, we knew that. The portal already told me that. But now, because it's a debug session, I can do all the normal debugging things. I can hover over all the variables and fields and everything. And so this index out of range, we can, I think, quickly see what the problem is. This parts array has only one element, but I'm using parts element 0 and parts element 1. So I can just kind of walk up my code and see this is the parts array. I can hover over the visitor or the security code. And this is where the problem is. The security code is an empty string, but it's trying to split it on a dot. So if you split an empty string, well, you're going to get one element that is itself, just an empty string. So now I can file a bug against the engineer and say, hey, there seems to be a problem. I debugged this. Sometimes the security code is empty. We need to take a look and see why that's happening. Now, again, because this is a real debugging session in Visual Studio, I can get far more information. So I get the full watch window in Visual Studio. So because this is an MVC application, I have a controller context. I can look at the current request. I can see what the request URI is. I get to see all this information. And remember, in minutes, I went from the portal, I found out I have a problem, I downloaded the debug diagnostic session, opened it, and I have a debugging session where I can see everything, just like you're debugging locally, but this is a remote machine. Yeah, question?
This probably requires some debugging features in your environment, doesn't it? Because usually this will slow down your productive application.
So the question is, will this slow down my application that's running? So let me, in the few minutes that I have, I have 0 minutes remaining. So we did analysis, so I have -1 minute, so I'll talk backwards, and that way I'll make up time. Application Insights, it doesn't track every single piece of detail of every single request. It mostly does sampling of requests. So it samples, let's say, about 1% of requests. And we did analysis to make sure, because we don't want to slow down the performance of your website. It's a single-digit performance decrease, single-digit percentage decrease. So maybe about 5% at most for only those requests where it's sampling. And the reason it's so efficient is that what happens is when this exception happens, and you can actually set custom breakpoints to say, I want you to capture this specific snapshot, it will clone the process quickly in memory, which only takes milliseconds, because it doesn't have to clone all the memory. Not all the memory is being written to all the time. So most memory is read-only. So it clones the process, lets it keep running, and then it might take a few more seconds, and it takes the crash dump from the cloned process. So it should really be not noticeable at all in any way whatsoever to the running application. No noticeable impact. Docker, sorry, go ahead.
Can I use such kind of insights also with a normal IIS or just with Azure?
So Application Insights is mostly an Azure feature, but I believe you can use it. It's not a .NET only feature though. So if you are running in Azure, whether you're using Node or Java, or you can also integrate it with mobile applications. So there's support for iOS and Android, so you can send telemetry information about your application back to Azure. So the data is all gathered in Azure, and this particular debug feature is an Azure-specific feature because it has to know about the running process to be able to debug it. But you still get telemetry information, things like the application map. You still see all of that, but there are certain features that are Azure-specific. So Docker, I think I'll have to just kind of run through this. Docker is really good. Go to Joe's session on and last session on tomorrow. So you'll really learn more about Docker. Sorry, but short story: we have really good support for Docker, Docker for Windows and Docker for Linux in Visual Studio for Mac, and on Azure. So check that out. So we have .NET Standard, maximum productivity. You already know C#. You already know .NET. use .NET Standard. .NET Core, cross-platform, fast-paced, standalone, side-by-side. You can have multiple versions installed at the same time. Really great for building web apps. Visual Studio Productivity, it's never been better. All the new C# features, which work on every version of .NET. Live unit testing, it's really huge. Visual Studio for Mac, not everybody uses the same PC. A lot of people use Macs. Mixed environment, mixed development. Everybody should be happy. And then with Azure, we saw in literally seconds or maybe a few minutes, we're able to debug a real crash that happened on a live running application. Then Docker, you get reliable deployment, configuration, and like I said, Joe, I'm sure, will tell you everything you want to know about Docker and probably some more. So I have another session right after lunch, deep diving specifically into .NET Core 2.0 and ASP.NET Core 2.0 back in the, I think this is the room where we started today, the Let's room. Yes, that's the one next to the food, the big room. And then reminder, there's a couple sessions tomorrow. So Peter, who I think I saw somewhere here, or was it, maybe he left. He has a talk tomorrow about using Xamarin Forms, so check that out for mobile development. And then, like I said, Joe has a talk called Goodbye VMs, Hello Docker, so that should be really fun. These are the same pointers as I had from this morning, so kind of same links as before, and that is it. Thank you very much. So it is lunchtime, but I'll just stick around, answer any questions anybody has.